Hello, folks. Welcome to the Scholar's Nook, where we offer mindful tips for the budding scholar. I'm Dr. Nick Wolf, and I'm with.
Dr. Stephen Lindenberger.
Thank you, Stephen. We're all glad you're here. Stephen, it's good to see you today. I thought we might want to discuss the topic of questions. Now, you may know that I used to teach a class here at Bellevue University pertaining to critical thinking. And one of the topics that we approached was the three broad categories of questions. There are questions of fact, questions of preference, and questions of judgment. Now, question of fact is one that simply has an objective right or wrong answer. A question of preference is a purely subjective question where there is no real right answer. It's whatever is best for you. And then there are questions of judgment, in which case there are better answers and worse answers, but no objectively right or wrong. So it's kind of like the hybrid of the two. Now, these categories seemingly are simple, but I found that sometimes those boundaries are fuzzier than we often think. So rhetoric is a big problem we have today, where one of the biggest tricks that we have is trying to convince people to put your question into one of those three categories where they not really aren't appropriate to sit in that particular spot. So sometimes people with very rigid worldviews would put a lot of human issues in objective terms. Some other folks might say that all behavioral norms are purely social constructs, and therefore any guards or any restrictions on that are inherently illegitimate. So what are your thoughts about trying to navigate these rhetorical waters?
Well, from a scholar standpoint, I think first of all, it would be very important to give examples of each one of these, which maybe we can do here in a minute. But
Sure.
My first thoughts when it comes to scholarship and research is that no matter where you're coming from, especially in qualitative research, which is my area of expertise, it's very important to put your thinking, if you will, right up front. And so if you're approaching a study through a critical race theory lens or some other social construct lens, it's important just to say that right up front instead of trying to bury it and supposedly have the data affirm or confirm your point of view. It's very important to put those biases or those points of views or those ways of thinking right up front. But if we could go back real quick, so a question of fact, can we have a couple of examples here? A question of fact, question of preference, and question of judgment. What's a good example of a question of fact?
Well, a lot of our more rigorous scientific measurements, like how long is a mile, or what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? These are objective questions.
Right.
So there's, if we are using useful, rigorous tools that can give us the same answer no matter who actually is doing the measuring. That's the idea.
Okay. And so a question of preference would probably be what? What's a good example of question of preference?
Any pure opinion would be a question of preference. What's your favorite color? Or what is what do you call a nice day? And that's depending upon what your particular preferences are. Maybe you want to have it to be a little gloomy outside, maybe a little bit of a higher moisture content in the air, more of a 75 degrees might be great for you. Another person might be 82 would be an ideal temperature. So there's really no right answer. It's basically subjective preference, which is those questions are answered.
Okay, very cool. And then a question of judgment. I thought you did a good job of explaining what that is. Some answers are better or worse than others. What's a good example of that?
Well, just about anything that's controversial.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Generally a question of judgment. What is the best economic system? What is the best system of government? Is it better to homeschool your kids than it is to use the public school system? Is it better to using a private school system? Anything that basically that in our everyday life where people disagree upon is usually a question of judgment.
Okay, excellent, excellent. But yeah, I also, and again, as it relates to research, man, it is so important to, to check yourself before you wreck yourself in this case, because if you don't think about each one of these before you embark on research, it's very easy to introduce unintentional bias into our studies.
Certainly is. And as you know, I tend a bit more on the quantitative side than you do. But I make it a very big point to help delineate the differences between fact and interpretations of the fact. I tell
Right.
my students that in any study, you're going to take some rigorous measurements. And the measurements, assuming that we've performed the measurements well using good tools, that is factual. Lengths or certain responses, those are that the information that you actually obtain is factual. But anytime you take that information and extrapolate or generalize to a larger group, that inherently is no longer factual. That's now interpretation. And therefore, it does escape that element of fact, moving into more of a judgment approach to sense making.
Right. That's great. And I'm really glad you brought that up. And what I see a lot of times, in fact, I was just looking at a dissertation that was sent to me for review, and it was very, very good. But I detected a lot of factual type language when we can't make these claims. So in other words, it was proven that, and like in the literature review, it was proven that, or it's a well-known fact that. No, not necessarily. And it's hard for students to understand that in the academic writing, it's not persuasion. It's actually very tentative. It's like, we don't know, this is what it appears to be. And that can be a little hard for students to make that pivot when a lot of our writing, in graduate school and below is more, trying to be persuasive or prove something. We're not really trying to prove, we're just trying to move the needle to a deeper understanding on something. And it's very, these questions of judgment and preference come in the language that we use in our writing. So I think it's very important to note that. I would also say this harkens back to the age-old, correlation is not causation. We have to look at our statistical measures, the correlations that we come up with as being able to explain part of the variance between the variables, but it is not necessarily a cause and effect, right?
I totally agree with that. And there's another concern that I have is sometimes what is true at one point is less true over time, especially when we're dealing with human systems. The fact that evolution in our ideas moves a lot faster than our biology. So even if we find in previous social science research from, like, let's say the 80s or 90s, a lot of what seemed to be true then is less true the further we further away we are from it. Which is why it's really important to try and, when we do our literature reviews, to also make sure that we have kept it updated and that we are reproducing studies as necessary in order to make sure that we still have a good handle on the truth. And that's ultimately, I see that as what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get closer to the truth because no one knows everything, but we can, through these studies, we can try to become more knowledgeable about what is true and what is most likely to be not true, or we're not sure, somewhere in between. And it's another aspect when I tell my students, again, going from that factual element to the interpretation element, is that you can always say declarative statements about the fact. But when you start talking about what that means, what's the meaning of that, always be very careful to qualify your language as well.
Right.
You want to make sure that you're saying, based upon this data, it suggests this is what's happening. But if you say suggests, you're already advertising the fact that you don't know for sure. This is what in your understanding the situation and how you're reasoning it. This is what seems to be happening, and that's the first step of constructing a new theory or a new understanding of your model. But we always have to keep enough intellectual humility to realize that we could be wrong. As long as we're doing that, we're going to be more likely than not we'll be right, or at least when we're wrong, we're going to be wrong small, and we're never going to promise more than we really know.
Right. This you bring up a couple of good points, and it triggered a couple of thoughts. Number one, I appreciate what you said about how research in the 80s and 90s has evolved, and what was true then may not be as true now. But then on the other hand, you got to love the seminal research like Hertzberg's, motivation theories. That actually seems to be more true than it was even back then. So that's always a treat to have, research that that is confirmatory. The longer that it's out there, the more that it's read. That's always a thrill to me. And there was a second point which I've forgotten, so I'll turn it back to you to continue your thought. But when I think of it, I'll jump back in.
Well, again, and the reason why you can still have the confirmatory analysis, that you are still asking the question.
Right.
Just because you answered the question once some time ago doesn't mean you don't have to reaffirm those questions over and over again. And many of us who are scholars with maybe slightly more of an activist perspective, I would say,
yeah,
they saw certain findings going back years ago, and they presume that those things are always happening, which I think is because obviously we are always struggling to become better people and to treat people more fairly and to do things in a way that's more fair, more egalitarian. And I think we do make steady progress, though it's hard. We make progress toward those goals. And I sometimes see some of my colleagues not appreciate the progress that's made to the extent that that I think the stats kind of bring out.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to make sure that we are all staying honest and realizing that we are all growing, and it's a work in progress.
Yeah, great points. And I did think of my second point that I want to make, which now it actually dovetails nicely with what you just said. And that is, I might have told you this before, Nick, but I attended a conference years ago, the Western Academy of Management conference, and a seminal researcher named Bill Starbuck, who's a statistician by trade and was actually editor of the Academy of Management Journal, did a fireside chat. And this conference was in Park City, so it was really a great setting. And the title of his fireside chat was The Insignificance of Significance. Now, this is coming from a statistician who, going back to what you were just saying, he used the analogy that we're grinding the stuff to a pulp, or sawdust. I think he used sawdust. We have studied something over and over and over so much and dialed the knobs just enough that we can always find significance. It's like we're trying to confirm what we already know. And so his call to action was to stop that, take a break, and go into the field and see if we can't find some new constructs that fit into theories or whatever that might explain the variance even better, instead of constantly trying to drill down to the point where we find significant findings. Because we know, and I've read this many times, that there's actually more bias introduced into quantitative research, through the sample selection, or the types of instruments we use, or the things that we leave out, either intentionally or unintentionally. Whereas qualitative research, you're really trying to go out, go native, find out what's going on, try to be as objective as possible to capture, interactions that lead to new constructs that can be studied. But I thought that was so cool that here's this world-renowned. In fact, after that conference, he was heading to Oxford to teach as a guest lecturer at Oxford. So this is this is a luminary in the field, and he was even pumping the brakes on relying too much on quantitative data to explain things. So
I totally understand that and agree with it. Jumping off from what you were saying a moment ago, that there's the different approaches that qualitative and quantitative approaches offer us and provide us. And I think one of the benefits of a qualitative approach is that we assume all questions are questions of preference going in. And that makes us extremely curious. And when you walk in with when you walk in with a quantitative mindset, and I tell this to my students all the time, quantitative work only identifies answers to questions you come with. Qualitative methods is what leads you to new questions.
Right.
So it's the closed-ended question format versus the open question format, which is the big differentiator between, I think, the two methods. I would advance that. I would suggest that.
Yes.
And because of that, if you walk in with a certain set of questions, you might miss some really important information because you're not asking questions that allow that information to get out. And qualitative methods and qualitative questions allow the participants to tell the story in their own words, which is what is, if you are really curious about trying to understand what they're saying, that's how you have to approach it. So when you're doing your research, you want to try and keep that open mindset, knowing that at some point down the line, you're going to have to put some more guardrails in. And maybe at that point, you will refine the ideas or critique the ideas that come out there, or add a little more context to it. But in the moment, when you're actually trying to solicit information, you want to keep all the criticism that critical mind voice in your back of your head. You should turn that off, or at least put it down, so that you are just listening. That's the important thing, I think.
That is so true. And yeah, I agree with everything you just said. And it's a lot harder than it sounds. Especially when you're doing cross-cultural research, for example, it's very, very hard to not, or like in some of my research, I have a particular point of view or a way of life or a tradition that is different than that I'm studying. And it's almost like you have to forget that and just let what's in front of you tell the story without this additional critical mind or comparing, one culture to another, especially when you're doing research cross-culturally. It's not a comparison. It's, letting the phenomenon develop right in front of you without that comparison element.
So that addresses some elements of listening to answers. Let's revisit the idea of questions here for a second.
Great.
One of the concerns that, at least that I see, is that there is a growing set of voices that really want to limit the questions that we ask. And I think that's unfortunate. I think that could be very dangerous. Yes. Because if you can't ask the questions, we have a long history in this as humans about questions we shouldn't ask, which lead to very bad outcomes. So what are your thoughts about what limits, if any, and in what context should limits to curiosity and the questions we ask be applied?
That's a lot. It's before noon. That's a big question before noon, but I'll take a stab at it. But I want to hear your thoughts too, Nick. But for me, it comes down to what you said before. As scholars, we're trying to get closer to the truth. We're trying to move our knowledge forward at all times. And as difficult and messy as it can be to do that, I don't think there should be any limits on what we ask, as long as it's done within a ethical framework, especially, and I'm speaking of research here, making sure that we're asking questions, or that the subject understands, or the group that we're dealing with understands what's going on, and that they have the right and obligation to let us know if those questions are triggering or whatever. That's fine. But it shouldn't stop us from bravely asking those questions, as long as everybody knows where they're coming from. And I think that's part of what we're dealing with in society. I read so many articles and watched so many interviews with comedians who are having a hard time being comedians because they're being limited in what they can say, think, ask, and so on. And that's not the role of the comedian. The comedian is to reflect ourselves back to us and all of its imperfections, and that sense of humor that we have really helps us with perspective taking. Bottom line is everybody has to be in on the joke. It's when somebody isn't in on the joke or the question, going back to what we're saying in research, that's what important. We shouldn't be deceptive in how we do this. That's off limits. As long as we're transparent, upfront, people know what they're getting into, I don't think any question should be off limit. What do you think, Nick?
Well, I think I agree with the vast majority. Actually, I agree with mostly what you said there. I do have a couple of clarifying points there. And this one, I think you actually be able to answer this or to speak to this better than I could. But a lesson I understand from the Jewish community is that their faithfulness requires their faith to be regularly challenged.
Absolutely.
So as a result, unlike I come from a Catholic background where it wasn't a an active practice of faith to constantly question the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
But I found that to be not the case in the Jewish community, where in order to strengthen their faith, they have to systematically challenge their faith regularly to strengthen it. Right. I see the same thing when it comes to truth and sense making in the academy or in any type of truth finding endeavor. We always have to constantly make sure that we are interrogating what we as a society believe to be true and what we personally believe to be true, because that's the only way we can make our ideas stronger.
Yeah, to me, it's almost like alchemy or a distillation process where you're just constantly trying to draw down. And if I may, I'll give you a quick story. You mentioned my work in the Orthodox Jewish community, and I've taught, in that community a lot on, in New York and the surrounding areas. And the very first class that I ever taught there, that morning I walked into that classroom and I couldn't have been more intimidated. It was 21 students, men and women, but the intellectual power was just coming off of them. I mean, you could just feel it. And as I started the lesson or the class session, I realized that the rules that I used back in my classroom in Omaha were not going to work. Because nobody waits for someone else to finish. People don't raise their hands. It seems kind of chaotic. It really put me off at first. And one of the students in that group came up to me during one of the breaks and said, "Hey, I can tell you're struggling with the way we learn." And I said, "Well, it's going to take me a minute to get used to, the organic nature of this." And he said, "If you're available tomorrow morning, we're going to take you to one of our yeshivas, which is basically a seminary." And I went the next morning with them. They picked me up at my hotel. We went in, and what I saw was groups of students sitting together with a text in front of them. And what I mean by a text is like a page of Talmud or a volume of the Talmud or the Torah. And they would be talking about a particular tractate, and there'd be 5 people asking 5 different questions, and that would spill over into the group sitting next to them. So it was almost like 3D, almost, when you think of like 3D chess or something, that's what it felt like. And to me, I instantly realized the power of that. And I stopped back home here in Omaha. I let all my classes just kind of run like that. Because the minute you start putting limits on the way people question, I mean, there's a certain thing as manners and so on, but that takes a backseat to the process of intellectual inquiry, and you just have to let it happen. So that was an adjustment for me, but it was a beautiful thing, and I can definitely see how it works to great effect.
Awesome. Cool. I would say that, yes, challenging your ideas is essential. We must do that in a way that we can still have safety as we allow those questions to be asked. But that's different from avoiding the conversations entirely. Because I've seen a bit too much of the latter instead of we're just not going to talk about that because that issue is too much. You say no, let's make the environment safe for people, but we can't avoid the conversations, because if so, we can't actually grow in that particular aspect of our lives.
And that is such an important point. And what a great point to make at this day and age and time where we're just so in fact, I didn't read the whole article, but Atlantic Monthly recently had an article about the current state of our culture and how, speaking of, religious matters and Judaism, he used the example of the Tower of Babel. He said we've almost become a nation that's turned into Babel, where, if you remember the story of the Tower of Babel, the curse that was put on the people in Babel because of building this tower is that they would all speak different languages. They weren't able to understand each other. They weren't able to communicate in meaningful ways. And we're almost to that point in our country where, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, it's like those are two different languages now. We can't have a dialogue. And same with, all the other, political correctness and other things that are going on, where it completely truncates our ability to communicate and to ask each other questions and to try to get to know the other person's point of view instead of just stopping the conversation right away.
Yeah, I think, just to piggyback off of what you said there, I think we went astray when we transformed adjectives into nouns, when we stopped adding additional descriptors of people and made them identity groups. Because you can go ahead and have more of an objective disposition when people talk about just what describe people, rather than if you take on those elements as you, as opposed to what ways to describe you. It makes it a lot harder to perform critique, or to even to differentiate, because now we're making identity so salient. The more we highlight how we are different, the less obvious is that we are the same.
That is so true. And that goes back to that whole idea of the Tower of Babel, doesn't it? I mean, it's just one more limit on our ability to communicate openly. So very good insights, Nick.
The other thing I wanted to say is, when it comes to allowing people to ask questions, it's amazing how sometimes it's the oddballs, the crackpots, the heretics who manage to bring in some important insights.
Yeah.
And we need to allow safety and space for those ideas to also be brought to the fore.
I agree.
And I don't know, I don't think we're doing enough of that right now.
I agree. Great point.
All right, so as we've turned to wrap this thing up, ramifications for research. Now, I see basically there are four things I'm worried. We kind of touched on some of the stuff here. When it comes to doing inquiry, when we're asking questions, we're trying to understand here, we want to try and, again, be more that open-ended, less judgmental, less restrictive, more of a questions of preference disposition when we're asking information, when we're being curious during inquiry. That's how I would see that. A lot of people tell their story. You think about the idea of a Daryl Davis. I'm familiar with him being the famous jazz musician who, African American man who really didn't understand why people in the KKK didn't like him. So he just walked up to these folks, started having conversations, knowing that they have reprehensible ideas. But through having conversations, he was able to humanize himself to the people who didn't like him and convince those folks, just through having good conversations, that, oh, he is a person and that he's worthwhile. And he has collected dozens and dozens of KKK robes from people who have given up the Klan because he came in with that approach to conversation with people who he didn't identify with initially.
It's a beautiful story. That's a beautiful story.
So that's inquiry. Now, when it comes to sense making, this is more the quantitative side, where we can't go so, because sometimes you want to have objective answers, because if we can't, we don't know. It's hard to zone in on what things are true if we can't agree that there is a right and a wrong answer to things. So when it comes to sense making, we need to be able to agree upon what's truth, as well as agree upon the tools that we can use to establish what is true. You know, I see some people who are having a doubtful perspective on the scientific method or on rigorous methods. And I'm sorry, that is not something anybody who's pursuing a doctorate should accept. We need to have a system that allows us to make sense in the world.
Right.
The scientific method is the best system we found thus far to get there. And that's my thought about sense making. Any disagreement there at all, or?
No disagreement at all. I think it's very important to have strictures, conventions. Doesn't mean they won't change. They won't evolve over time.
Sure.
But you have to start where everybody's in agreement at this point in time. So yes, Nick, I totally agree.
The third thing I want to talk about is prescriptions, recommendations to help the people who you're dealing with. If you're going to offer recommendations in the workplace or in a new social system, you probably need to have secured consent for the people who could be affected by that. You need to have buy-in from those folks. If you come in, not only if you try to introduce new ideas or new processes or new things into a system with people in it, if they haven't bought into it, it's not going to work. It's also, in many ways, it could be quite detrimental to those folks, and we don't want to be harmful.
Right.
Like all practitioners, rule number one is do no harm to the patient, and
yes,
and we should be approaching it as practitioners, as practitioner scholars. We need to adopt that perspective, that demeanor with our client firms, their client individuals.
absolutely. That's great.
And then the final things about policy. Those are the things we want to try and to erect to help support society as a whole. I think that if you do not have a good, rigorous foundation, there is no reason, and you have no justification to offering policy prescriptions. It's if you have prescriptions you can test out, you're over by doing that and testing over time, you're building a track record to make the case later for maybe policy proposals. But if you are working particularly only qualitative work, you're going to go from that level up to policy level, I think you're making a pretty large gap in logic, and you're maybe way off in how you're what you're likely to do going forward.
Well
What do you
said.
think?
Totally agree. I have nothing to add. You're absolutely right.
Cool. Well, as we finish up, is there anything you want to add, or what do we miss in this conversation?
I think we covered a lot of territory in a short period of time. I can't think of anything else I want to add, but I would just reinforce the notion that, it's important for us to stay intellectually honest when we embark on our research journeys, be as intellectually honest as possible and using all the techniques we talked about here. And also, I don't think we can emphasize enough the need to create a psychologically safe environment for people to be able to tell their story, to share their ideas, and not worry about it being twisted or some sort of negative reaction to it. And as researchers, we really do have to be as dispassionate as possible and suspend our biases, a lot of our beliefs, and let the data speak for itself. And I think what we've talked about here today Nick, I give you a lot of credit for putting together a wonderful program of ideas to think about. We should all go back and revisit these before we embark on our leadership, or pardon me, our research journey. I'm a leadership researcher, so that always leaks in there. But yeah, any research you're doing, it's important to keep these things in mind.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank everybody for listening today. And until next time, this has been Nick.
And this is Stephen.
Reminding you to think better.
Think better.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.